Now, almost everyone in this room has had an experience at one time or another of going incognito. That is, we've had fun pretending to be someone else. Now, like many of you, I remember dressing up at Halloween as a child, and in that era, the things that you most often could be were witches or pirates or skeletons or cowboys and cowgirls. And we would go to our neighbors' houses and say trick or treat, and they played along with the game, wondering who you were. So I'm sure that many of you remember those kinds of days. That's one of the first times that we may have appeared incognito. But time passes, and maybe as adults, someone invites you to a masquerade party. And if you ever went to something like that, you might make or borrow or rent some kind of a costume. And you might pretend to be a character of some kind, somebody from history or from a movie, maybe from a cartoon. Thinking of the cartoon characters brings to mind those crazy plastic masks that you couldn't breathe through, but you wore them anyway, and you pretended you were someone else. But then there are times that being incognito can be part of an honorable occupation or profession. Now, police sometimes work undercover and are not who they really are, so that they can go undercover and perhaps catch somebody in some kind of criminal activity. They act like they belong to that particular group, dress like them, talk like them, act like them, in order to get the kind of information and perhaps catch a criminal in the very act, so to speak. So when acting this way, the police seem to be a natural part of that scene. If the people they're with would know that they are police, they would treat them very differently. So, with all that in mind, let's look at today's gospel from that kind of a theme, going incognito or wearing a mask. The parable today is about the sheep and the goats. Now, it's one of the most famous parables, but it's not generally one someone will say that is their favorite. Usually we name something like the Good Samaritan parable or the Prodigal Son parable as being something that we really consider to be a favorite. But when we get to this one about sheep and goats, not so much. This one makes us feel that much more uncomfortable, and so it's probably not the favorite of very many of us. So, how does this begin? Well, the disciples are with Jesus and they say to him, "What's it going to be like at the end of the world?" And Jesus says, "Let me tell you a story. This is how it would be. Now, there's a king up in heaven, and all the people on earth are gathered around him, and the king will divide the people between the sheep and the goats." So far, so good. If you're one of the disciples, you really understand this because you have seen where there are shepherds that have both sheep and goats, and they graze together. But when they come together at night, they separate the sheep from the goats, and they put them in different pens. So the disciples kind of understand this sort of metaphor. It's familiar to them. And then Jesus continues with his story. The sheep will be on the right, and the king will say, "Come into my party. I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger, you welcomed me. I was naked, you gave me clothing. I was in prison, you visited me." And they are just incredulous. They can't quite figure this out. They say, "When did we ever do this?" And the king replied, "Whenever you did these things for the littlest people, you did them for me." Then the king addresses the goats on his left. And he says, "Depart from me into eternal damnation, because I was starving and you did not give me food. I was thirsty. You didn't give me anything to drink. I was a stranger. You did not welcome me. I was lacking clothing, and you didn't clothe me. I was in prison. You didn't visit me. And they said, Lord, if we only would have known it was you, we would have treated you differently. If we only had known your true identity, it would have made all the difference. If we had only known it was your face behind the face of those refugees at the border, if we only knew that it was your body in the infirmary, if we had only known it was your body starving in Africa, if we had only known it was you, it would have made all the difference. But the Lord says to them, depart from me into eternal damnation. Now, it's at this point that I'm reminded of something that Mark Twain once said, and it was this. It's not those parts of the Bible that I do not understand that bother me. It's the parts of the Bible I do understand that bother me the most. So, what kind of a lesson can we gather from what we've heard here? Well, one of the first lessons is a certain awareness. And that awareness is that our God, the true God, the God who created the universe, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who raised Jesus from the dead, that this true God of ours is a hidden God. He's one who hides himself. He goes incognito around us all the time. That God sometimes wears a mask. Our God hides himself almost completely in the faces and places of suffering. The awareness that our God is a hidden God who hides himself in suffering is a stark contrast to the gods in most of the other traditions and religions of the world. You see, in most of those religions, they would talk about their God being revealed in the beauty of a sunset, the birth of a baby, and the bounty of nature. And truly, our God can be seen in those places too. But our God is the only God in the whole world who hides himself under the faces and places of suffering. So let me give an example here. Now, suppose you're playing hide and seek with some children at your home, and they might hide next to a chair or under a table or maybe behind a curtain, and that's pretty obvious, right? And when you find them, they're delighted and they squeal with laughter. But every once in a while, they might seriously hide and go down into the basement and maybe hide behind the hot water heater or in a closet, a storage area that you'd never expect to find them. And maybe you couldn't find them at that point. And again, they burst out laughing and delighted because they fooled you. So, by analogy, most of the religions of the world have gods that hide themselves in obvious places, like underneath the kitchen table or under the bed behind the door. These gods hide themselves in the beauty of a sunset, the birth of a baby, the bounty in nature. And again, our God can be found in those places too, but our God, the true God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is somewhat different. Our God might be like the child who goes down into the basement and hides someplace that you can't quite figure out. So think about that. Where might God be hiding in a case like that? Now, one place that we know that our God hides and that we expect to find him is in the wine and the wafer here at the altar. But primarily, the place our God hides most is on the cross, because no other God in the whole world gets himself crucified. When our God is crucified, our God is most hidden. When our God is being crucified today in the suffering of others around us, our God is the most hidden. So a primary understanding for me when I think of this passage is our God is hidden. But the real point of the story today is not that our God is primarily a hidden God. The real lesson of the parable is that God is issuing us an invitation to go out, open our eyes, and seek God. Not only in the beauty of a sunset or the birth of a baby or the bounty of nature, not to find God in those wonderful and beautiful places that are so obvious. It's easy to conclude that God is there. When we see all this beautiful natural place that we live in, the hills and the rivers, the forests, that's easy. That's wonderful if we find God there. But instead, I think that this parable is telling us to look for God where God is to be found, and where God is hiding behind the faces and the places where people are suffering. Here's an example from one of our saints, St. Francis of Assisi. He was a young man, was riding high in life, privileged. And a friend would say this about him: he was a high type of person, living a high type of life. And he was riding high on his horse one day, like a knight in shining armor. St. Francis was feeling good and cocky and confident about himself. But underneath, he was also feeling very empty. As he was riding along on his horse one day, he stopped, and there at his feet was a beggar. He looked at that beggar, and that beggar had leprosy. His body was filled with open sores and wounds from that leprosy, and Francis decided that he would get down from his horse, and he bent down and picked up that man and looked into his face. And then he did something unusual. He put his arms around the beggar. He put his face onto those open wounds. He hugged that man. And when he pulled away from hugging him, he looked into his face, and there saw the face of Jesus looking back at him. The story reminds us that revolutionary changes like that can occur in any of our lives. And we too need to reach out and hug and embrace and pull close to us those who are hurting in this world. This story is an invitation for us to embrace a suffering humanity, just like St. Francis did, just as Jesus did. But first, what does it mean for us? What does it mean to embrace a suffering world that way? Well, first of all, it means to have the love of Christ inside of us. Because you can't have this kind of a loving person be yourself unless the love of Christ is already living in you. It's that kind of love that's in you, and it's not natural to any of us. Not natural to you and not natural to me. But the love of God living inside of us causes us to be able to embrace people, because that love lives in us. And it begins at home. In the unconscious acts of generosity to your spouse, your children, your parents, your siblings, whoever it is that you call family. You don't even realize you're doing it. And as I look around at the people within our parish here at St. Luke's, I see many people lovingly care for family members who have chronic illnesses or might be suffering from dementia. And if you would mention to them that they are loving that person in a special way, they'd look at you and say, what in the world's wrong with you? What's wrong? We're doing what any loving parent, any loving spouse, any loving family member would do. This is not special. There are others among us that are helping to raise grandchildren and great-grandchildren because the need is there and the love of Christ within them compels them to extend themselves in that way. What I'm suggesting is that this quality of love begins at home with these unconscious acts of generosity. Now, when Jesus addressed those sheep, they didn't have any idea that they were being generous. They weren't aware of that. It's the way that they were. It's who they were as people. It's the true love of God operating through them that caused them to be able to respond to others around them in that way. And this quality of love then will spread from you to your home, to the neighbor down the street, maybe to someone who's had a stroke and needs some help, or a person who's crippled and for some reason you get involved with them. You just do it. That's the kind of love that spreads. You begin to realize that people in your neighborhood, in your town, in your school district, these people are hungry. They need clothing. They need shelter. And you respond perhaps by helping to bag groceries at the food pantry, or by tutoring youngsters in reading or math. Or maybe you sleep overnight at the homeless shelter to provide them a place to lay their head down in peace. You begin to realize that there are other brothers and sisters in Africa, Asia, Latin America, maybe in the ghettos of our own large cities, people who are hungry and starving. And the quality of love that you embrace within you from God cannot help but reach out to help people like that. The love of God living inside of us begins to reach out to all kinds of people. We don't even think about it. We just do it. Because you see, the truth about the gospel is that our God is a hidden God. But the truth goes so much further than that. We're invited to go out and to seek God wherever God is to be found. And as much as people sometimes tease me when I say, I wonder, I do wonder. I wonder what hiding place I will find God in next. I wonder. Stay tuned, because I'll probably tell you about it later. Amen.